Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting an urban landscape. It's a night scene and it's a night street scene in a small town. I've started off by just roughly penciling in a few guidelines, and now I've wet the paper and I'm using raw sienna just to establish where I want the light between the buildings at the end of the street. I want to keep a bit of the white paper in the buildings towards the right, as I'm going to try and get a sort of shop window established there. I want it to look like it's been raining, like the pavements are wet, and so the buildings and figures are reflecting in the pavement. A typical sort of urban cityscape, if you like. I'm just going to use three colours in this. The raw sienna, I'm going to use indigo and Paynes grey, and then I'll finish it off at the end with a little bit of white gouache. I'm just going to paint a backdrop, an underpainting, using those three colours and the wet in wet technique, just to kind of get a sort of a very loose, simple, flowy sort of background. Now, I'm not experienced in painting urban landscapes, so this is a bit of an experiment. You'll have to bear with me, but you have to start somewhere. If you want to paint a certain subject, it's good to just dive in, be bold and see what happens. And you can, of course, learn from your mistakes. It's the best way to learn, and discover things that you like about this. Now, what I'm finding out so far is that I like the downward flow of the paint wet in wet. I think it's going to give me some texture on the buildings that I wouldn't be able to paint if I tried. That's something that wet in wet watercolour painting does for you. It gives you that sort of vertical orientation to the painting, which is a good starting point for painting buildings, I think. Just pulling down more paint with a fairly weak mixture of the paint in my haki brush, and strengthened up that right hand side because I want the sides to be in shadow eventually, so I'm just starting to establish that in the underpainting here, trying to sort of keep the idea of the perspective lines as the buildings and the street comes closer to us as the viewer. The other thing I'm trying to be aware of is to keep that corridor of light on the left between the two streets. There's no real system to this yet. I haven't worked that out. But eventually, I think if I do enough street scenes, I should actually hopefully get a feel for it and actually understand a bit more what I'm doing. But at the moment, it's just, keeping my fingers crossed and going for it, really, which is quite exciting. And I think I like the look of this as an underpainting. I think just going to add a little bit more texture and spatter on, using the haki brush, some clean water, just to cause it to make some spots and blooms and added texture. How much of that I'll still have at the end of the painting, I have no idea, but I think it looks quite interesting. So I've got mostly the lights and the mid-tones here. The next stage is going to be putting in some darks, but I think I'll add a bit of dark spatter as well. So I'll mix up some Paynes grey and indigo and just spatter carefully across the bottom part. I don't want to spatter across the light areas, just across the bottom, just to increase the texture that I've got there. The paper's still a bit wet, so that will all diffuse a bit anyway. It's all dry now, so I've taken a couple of flat brushes, a large one about 1.5 inches and a 3/4 inch flat, and I'm going to alternate between them and start putting in a bit more detail. This area here, I want to try and build that up to look like a shop window if possible. So I'm just mark making, really, abstract marks that will all sort of come together with dry brush strokes and dark shadow, and leaving the white unpainted paper as well, layering it up and sort of putting in bits of outline here and there, and hopefully eventually that will start to look like a shop window. Want to try and sort of bring this flat backdrop to life a little bit more loosely, though, without too much detail, just kind of suggesting the detail if I can. I'm going to really increase the darks across the bottom of the shop front and this edge, this right hand edge here. Lots of shadow. That's already showing the shape and the form of this area a little bit more, I think. And as we go further back, I'm going to use less detail and just literally use the flat brush just to suggest a few windows, maybe doorways, that sort of thing. Just marks getting a little bit closer together as they get further away. I'm not going to put in every window either, just a few, just to kind of suggest that shadowy distance before we get to the end of the street. Just adding the darks here and there, fairly fast strokes can give quite a fresh look if you can keep them nice and vertical. Helps to increase the suggestion of this being a building. I'm going to just concentrate a bit more on getting the reflections in the wet pavement and road established as well. And back to the Harkey brush, just to kind of add a little bit of a random texture and directional strokes to the pavement and the road, just to kind of break up the fact that most of the painting is made up of strong verticals and horizontals. Just put a little bit of texture down there. I think it just helps to balance it. Some sort of soft and hard edges there as well. I think that's nearly looking how I want it to look. As I say, I'm not really used to painting these sorts of scenes, but it's a good starting point, I think, to try and see if you can get one painted. Now I'm going to put in just some details, a few street lamps, maybe cables and things going across, stretching across the road. Finishing touches, really. Just linking one side of the street to the other using the rigger brush. Sort of something in nothing, really. I'm not copying anything here, so I'm just using my imagination and remembering street scenes that I've seen by wonderful painters like Castanet, how they use the street lamps and the cables to stretch across the road and sort of link the painting together, and it's those little bits of details that really helps. trying to paint quite loosely and quickly so that it doesn't look too tight. Just want it to look quite loose and impressionistic. I've just added a bit of white gouache for street lamps and highlights. I think I'm nearly there, apart from a few figures. Yeah, I think that looks okay now. I'm going to try and paint in a figure, a couple of figures. I've worked out where my horizon or eye level is roughly, and I'm going to make sure that my figures' heads are about the same as the horizon line. I'm going to paint two figures there just against the light between the two streets. I think they show up quite nicely there. Make sure that they've got some either shadows or sort of reflections just pulled straight down vertically. I just think another person or a couple of people just in the midground. Can of course put as many or as few people or none at all if you don't want to in them, but I think I'm trying to put more people in these sorts of scenes. Even though it's quite difficult, it can really bring the scene to life. I think I should just leave it at these two groups of people for the demonstration. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed painting it, even though it's not what I had in mind, and really it's a good starting point for me to be able to try and learn how to paint this difficult genre of painting. It kind of looks quite, not easy, that's the wrong word to describe it. When you look at urban landscapes, they look very freely painted, very expressive and really interesting and lively. But it's actually a very, very difficult thing to do. But as I said earlier, if you want to paint these sorts of things, it's good to practice, not worry about failing or not living up to your own expectations. Just paint, and the more you try, the more you'll learn. You'll learn new things, you'll learn what to try and what not to do. I think here, one of the lessons I'll take away from this painting is that I really like this colour scheme for a nighttime painting. But I think I just need to go a bit lighter on the underpainting, not fuss around quite so much, keep that a bit more fresh, and then be a bit more considered and careful and thoughtful when painting in the details. Just putting some white gouache on the shoulders of the people, and it just helps them to stand out even more. And that's it. I think that's about it, the finished painting now. Well, thanks so much for watching. There are 3 real-time tutorials for this on Patreon, so just follow the link if you might be interested in joining our Patreon group. There are quite a lot of tutorials over there already, and you get early access to YouTube videos. And there's a lovely community over there. We've got a Facebook group which you can join once you've joined Patreon. Okay, so thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.